Brett Wigdortz OBE is a philanthropist, entrepreneur, and also the founder of Teach First and Teach for All, organizations which are dedicated to breaking the link between low family income and poor education. Brett has described the disparity of education as the biggest civil rights issue of our time. And having grown up in New Jersey and having travelled all over the world as a journalist and consultant for McKinsey's, Brett has encountered many cultures and was always drawn to education and social mobility. In this fascinating conversation, we define what education actually is and its role in society, the private education system and its impact on equality and social mobility, its relationship to the labour market, and also how the UK measures up globally in terms of education. I learned a lot chatting to Brett. Some of his points were quite profound. I think you'll love it. Brett, thank you so much for coming on the Tech Leaders podcast. It's great to have you.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
I'd love to maybe get your version of your formative years. And crucially, what did you want to be when you grew up?
I was just looking through some books with my children that I filled out when I was a child. So at some point, I wanted to be an astronaut. It was the 70s or 80s when that was a big thing. At some point, I wanted to be an astronomer. And then I wanted to be I think I got into boring stuff like being a lawyer or an actor. I don't know. I had a lot of stuff I wanted to be. And then probably the best thing I ever did was I went to law school for about a week and dropped out when I was 21. And that was probably the best decision of my life.
Yeah, 1 week is probably too much. Can you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I grew up in New Jersey in America. I lived in Hawaii for a while where I have some family. After university and dropping out of law school, I actually got a job at McKinsey as a management consultant. I worked in Asia for a bit. They sent me to London to do work on war for talent issues, how businesses and banks could attract better talent. And then I got onto a project looking at how businesses could help education. And I come from a family of teachers. My brother's a teacher, my parents, aunts, uncles, almost everyone's a teacher in my family. And I started realizing schools have a very similar issue to businesses on the war for talent, that it's a great job teaching, but they need to package it maybe differently. And there's different ways they could attract additional excellent teachers that schools need, especially in the most lowest income areas of the country. And that led me to start Teach First in 2002. I then left McKinsey. At first, it was a 6-month leave of absence, but then I left for 15 years and led it for 15 years, grew it to become the largest graduate recruiter in the UK. So many of your listeners might know Teach First. We're the biggest recruiter at most universities in the country, including Oxford, Cambridge, and others. And we attract people to teach in low-income schools as part of a wider leadership movement and how to ensure all children get access to a great education. And then I also co-founded Teach for All, which brought Teach First globally now into about 60 countries. So I was spending about a quarter of my time traveling around the world, helping get Teach First programs started everywhere from Bangladesh to Australia to Germany to Chile to Lebanon to Ghana to all over the world. And I left in 2017 after 15 years and thought, what did I want to do next? And during my time in education, I got very interested in early years. Because what I saw was by the time kids are teenagers, you have brilliant teachers out there and brilliant schools that do a lot to close the gap to help ensure kids from lower income backgrounds or who come from more disadvantaged groups are able to succeed. But it's much harder when they're teenagers than it is when they're younger. And what you see is a gap starts growing when children are very young. And there's been all this scientific evidence over the last 10 years that's developed on the importance of early years education. I also have 3 children myself. And I could see the difficulty of finding good early years care and education. It's really hard. And as I traveled around the world, I saw that's a problem all over the world. It's not just a British problem, it's a global problem. So I tried to think, how can we help early years education? And again, going back to the war for talent, how can we get more talented individuals to work with and teach small kids? And that's what led me to come up with the idea of Tiney, which I started a couple of years ago with some co-founders and got me very passionate about it.
Let's look at this from a bird's eye view and let's get all bigger picture then, Brett. Okay, so can you just describe or can you define education for me and what role does it play in modern society?
Often I'd meet people from a business world or other worlds who said, oh, yeah, education is really easy. You just have to do A or you have to do B or you have to do C. And I often would give speeches where I'd give examples of people throughout history of what they felt education was important, whether it was Cicero or whether it was ancient Israel and the Talmud, or whether it was Confucius, or whether it was. And what was just interesting is for thousands of years, the greatest minds throughout the world have debated and disagreed on what is education and what is the purpose of education. There is no easy answer. Anyone who tells you there's an easy answer is wrong. And in the end, it's whatever a certain society believes is important for education. And it really is around societal norms, what you need from a great education. I think our society, with the norms we would say to have a great education, is to function in modern British society. That partly means being able to hold down a good job, raise a family, being able to function in society, being able to have, even some British values, I think people would say are an important part of education. So that obviously means you have to be highly literate, you have to be highly numerate, you have to have certain knowledge, you have to have certain skills. And that's what we, I think, as a British society have believed is a good education. But that's something that's very different in different societies and at different points in history.
Sure, absolutely. Great answer. Almost an impossible question to answer, really, but I think you did a great job. You came over from the US, Brett, obviously been involved in the education sector in the UK. Would you be able to give me maybe the most positive aspect and the most negative aspect of the education system in the UK right now?
So I'm going to start with the glass half full, in that the education system in the UK is much better now than it was 20 years ago. And I think everyone needs to recognize that. And sometimes we can be down on ourselves a bit too much. 20 years ago, most schools in London, and I think most schools in the country, especially in low income areas, were not getting the most out of the children in those schools. And I visited a lot of schools in lower income areas where the head teachers would say things like, I just want these kids to stay out of jail. I just want these kids to stay off the street. And the goals for the young people would be very, very low. No one would want their kids to go to. I think most of those schools would have been closed down by now. And certainly some schools in London and in some other areas of the country are among the best schools in low-income areas in the world, I'd say, among the best in the world. So there's some outstanding, truly outstanding schools that are doing amazing things. That's the first thing I'd say, that the trajectory over 20 years, and it's not one government or another, but I think it's a 20-year trajectory, has improved. Whether COVID has started to turn that improvement around, that's a worry. But overall, it's been an upward trajectory. There's both positive and negatives around an aspect of the British system, the English system, which is around there's a lot of tests. Kids get tested a lot. They get tested young, and the tests have a huge bearing on what they do, as opposed to a much more liberal arts system like America. The disadvantage is there's a lot of stress around that. A lot of often young children or young teenagers have to work very hard and do things that maybe make long life decisions and have less time to, choose and have a much wider liberal arts education. The advantage of the testing is that testing is one of the very few ways, children from lower income backgrounds can actually prove themselves, and that's gone back to ancient China, where, ancient China had a very merit-based civil service. It was one place in the world, unlike Europe, where kids from very poor backgrounds could get very good jobs because even thousands of years ago, they had this testing system. So I often push back at people who are against GCSEs or testing. In some ways, it is a way that kids from lower income backgrounds can succeed, while, in many other systems, it's very difficult if they can't prove themselves through tests. But that is certainly a disadvantage. I see in American other systems, the much more liberal arts education, where people get a much broader education. There's advantages to that also.
Sure. I'm a big believer in meritocracy and social mobility and things like that. How would you say the UK ranks on the global stage in that respect?
I mean, not great. So, I think statistically, the UK as a whole doesn't rate great for social mobility. I'm not sure if that's just education. I think there's much wider cultural and economic reasons behind that, as opposed to other countries where it's just set up differently. So I wouldn't pin all that on education. There's the whole private school thing that happens in England, where maybe 8 or 9% of the kids go to private school, but they get a massive percentage of places at top universities, even though I think most people would say most private schools are not outstanding, or not any better than state schools in the UK. There's all sorts of cultural reasons, I think, for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Have you ever looked at the case study of Finland? I think Finland was one of the worst performing education systems in the world, and they looked at their system and essentially turned it on its head and sort of got rid of homework and made the learning more sort of hands-on and sort of functional learning, as opposed to more like, classroom stuff and things like that. They made those necessary changes, and a couple of years later, they were the top performing education system in the world. So do you think the current system of GCSEs, A-levels, university or apprenticeships or whatever, what would you do different, Brett?
Gosh, yeah, that's a good question. 16 is quite young, I think, to do some of these exams. I mean, I would wonder about whether you do them at 18 rather than 16. And I also wonder whether a very tight A levels, where people do just three A levels or so is the right way, or if a much broader topics that people work on at 18, I think is what happens at most systems. I think 16 is a very young age for these sort of exams. I would say for Finland, I visited Finland, and I remember chatting to the education minister there, who laughed and said basically it's one of their newest income streams in Finland is getting global education experts to come and look at their system basically, and charging these people. And I think what he actually said in a very Finnish, like understated way, was he didn't think they had an outstanding education system. If it was British, I think we'd be screaming it from the rooftops. But his point was, I don't think we have an outstanding education system. It's just more of the culture of Finland. And I think often what you find is so much of it comes from the cultural system of that country. So Finland is a very egalitarian system. It's a system where people work together. People don't choose schools. So parents have no choice of school. You just go to your local school. And all the schools are good. They would say they don't have any outstanding schools, but they also don't have any bad schools. They don't have those winner-take-all tests because that's not the sort of country they are, the system they are. I often think there isn't a perfect system out there. I've visited 40, 50 countries around the world and visited schools and talked to lots of education ministers. And I don't think there's a perfect system out there. I think politicians like looking at systems, but what I get excited about is it's about the talent in the schools. This is why both with Teach First and now with Tiney, I think the real focus is how do you get the best people to be educators? That's something that is more difficult, but if you get the best leaders to lead schools and become educators, usually they'll make the right decisions and they'll do a good job.
Yeah, sure. So they don't have any private education system at all in Finland, I don't think. I suppose it's a societal thing, though, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a very cultural, historic thing in England. And there's a lot of evidence that private schools in England are not better than state schools. I mean, I often talk to middle-class individuals who are scrimping and saving and borrowing money to send their kids to private schools. And I say to them, look, I know where you live. I know the local state school right near your house. That's an outstanding school. I mean, sure. Why wouldn't you send your kids to that school down the road? That's fantastic. And I think it is a historical sort of baggage thing as opposed to really what gives their kids the best education sometimes.
The cultural aspect of private schools as being high achieving places, I think, is the biggest draw, isn't it? Because I've worked in tech recruitment and in the recruitment world. I've never heard a CTO, a CEO, or head of recruitment within an organization say, I only want applicants who've gone to private school. So, I mean, I'm just not sure how much of an X start it is in terms of the career ladder, if that makes sense.
It's going down, the percentage of kids in private schools, and you're seeing a lot of private schools getting more...
is it really? Okay.
Yeah, more overseas students, actually. And I think part of it is they're pricing themselves out of middle-class families now.
Sure,
private schools are getting very expensive.
I've heard you say in the past that the disparity of education in the UK is the biggest civil rights issue of our time. How optimistic are you about the future of this in the UK?
I'm sure there are other civil rights issues that I'm probably less qualified to talk about, but it seems to me just a basic, if there's schools in the country that you wouldn't want your children to go to, but other parents are forced to send their kids there, then those children do not have the same civil rights as your children. That's how I look at it. If all children don't have access to the same outstanding education, then some children are getting a massive leg up in life and others aren't. And I think it is a civil rights issue, and people don't pay enough attention to the civil rights aspect of that, I think, you are disadvantaging a whole swath of children for the rest of their life, basically because of where they were born and where they live. And, to me, that's a massive civil rights issue. If you had asked me a few years ago, I would say I was feeling things were improving, though slowly. And I think one of the things that was exciting was over a 10-year period, you started seeing non-selective schools in disadvantaged areas showing the same results as schools in more advantaged areas, And for a while there, I visited schools where they'd say, look, if we had any smart kids in this school, we'd send them to a private school and give them a scholarship or send them to a grammar school, and it would be that sort of really awful attitude that was really depressing. Now I think that's a different attitude, and we could say actually you can do well in a school in a disadvantaged circumstance, and you can get good results, because there's some outstanding educators there, and I think a number of schools have really proven what's possible. I think there have been some improvements, some of the changes, some of the academies, and some of the other improvements over the last 20 years have helped things. The last few years, I would say things have begun to turn down in a way that really worries me. So the gap was decreasing. I started something called the Fair Education Alliance that I'm on the board of. And we set 5 goals for a 20-year period, which were 5 gaps that exist between children young people from disadvantaged families and wealthier families around GCSE results, university results, like jobs, happiness, and primary school SATs. And these gaps were getting smaller and smaller. And then we've seen over the last few years, they've started to grow again. And I think COVID had a big part of that.
Yeah.
I think, I don't know if there's enough of a push with the current government on continuing to close the gap. And I think we did have a 10-year period where we had people like Andrew Adonis, and agree or disagree with Michael Gove, but we had serious people, I think, in education who were really focused on closing that gap. And I don't know if there's been that focus over the last 5 years or so. And I think COVID has really hurt things because, the kids from less advantaged backgrounds were really, really hurt by COVID in a really serious way that I think we're only beginning to come to terms with.
What do you envisage the medium to long-term impact of that will be to that age group, Brett? I
don't think as a country we've come to terms yet with how big an effect that's going to have on a lot of children and teenagers who have been through that. I think for those of us who are lucky enough to have, good broadband, lots of laptops, all the children have their own bedrooms and their own space. Our children had an effect. I mean, I know my children, there was a negative effect of all the lockdowns, but it was nothing compared to lots of young people who literally missed 2 years of school completely and will never get that back, and already we're living with a gap, that existed. So, I mean, I know lots of children, in the schools that Teach First works in, most of whom would not have their own bedroom, for instance, or many of whom wouldn't have good broadband, much less, even a laptop, even if they do get one from school. Some of the structural problems they had over the last few years were just massive. And, I think a lot of schools are seeing that since lockdowns ended.
You've mentioned sort of aspects of your current organization, Tiney, in terms of what you guys do and things. But could you just give us a little bit of an overview in terms of your motivation for setting up Tiney and what sort of the purpose of the organization and the problem you're trying to solve?
It was basically by just over 15 years visiting lots of schools and realizing lots of children, secondary schools are important and great educators can have a huge difference in secondary schools. Then we started working in primary schools and we realized, a lot of kids, by the time they're in year 7, already they're underachieving or a massive gap exists that's difficult to close. But more and more, a lot of our teachers were saying, look, even in year 1, year 2, year 3, children were unable to communicate, unable to play. We're not talking about doing calculus at that age, but more unable to learn. I mean, unable to really succeed in school at a young age. That, combined with the fact that there's been so much new neuroscience over the last decade, some really big knowledge increase around how brains are developed at a young age, that really shows the importance of a good early years education base at age, even 1, 2, 3, and 4. And how that sets you up for the rest of your life and how that sets you up with enabling you to learn more the rest of your life. I think there's no question that most societies, including ours, under-resources early years education. I think if we're really talking about how do you ensure children get the best quality education, we should put more resources into early years education because that has the biggest bang for the buck, But yet most societies, including ours, see it as a way to help parents back to work, basically, and more as a babysitting thing. So that was the concern I started with. And then what I realized all over the world, there's a shortage of good early years educators. And I think why there's a shortage of good early years educators is not because people don't like working with small kids. The truth is lots of people love working with small kids. The problem is the pay is awful. It's much less than a teacher's pay, which is ridiculous. It's less than minimum wage in many nurseries even, which they somehow manage to do. And the working conditions are horrendous, basically. So the problem with early years education is all about supply, just like teaching and Teach First. How can we get an additional supply of outstanding early years educators into there? And to do that, I think you need to pay them a professional salary. So they should be earning £30,000 or so a year, maybe more. They should have that flexibility to do it, while taking care of their own children, which is a concern of many of them. And they should feel part of a professional community. And it should just be easy for them. Like they should just be able to focus on educating and on the children in their care. They shouldn't have to worry about business aspects or other things. So I think that's very difficult in nurseries because in nurseries, there's so much overhead and costs. And that's why nurseries pay their staff so low for the most part. But I think it's not that difficult to do in childminding, which is basically small nurseries people run in their homes. And what I saw was that childminding is something that feels very old-fashioned, and it was ready for a refresh and a rebrand. And it's a great job to me, it fits with like the whole Airbnb, Uber, like the way, many people want to work, about using their resources twice, using their house or their car in a different way, and actually taking home most of the income for that. So what we try to build is a tech-based way for people to open up these small nurseries in their homes, operate as childminders in a very easy way, and make a professional salary that way.
Absolutely. It's kind of the share economy and the gig economy sort of roll into one, really, isn't it?
Mm.
So what's next for Tiney then? What's your growth plans? How do you see the future?
We've been building a product. It's a very tech-based business. Like I said, one of my co-founders was the CTO and one of the co-founders of Gray's snack business. The other one was ran a big digital design studio.
Sure.
And it's a very digitally based company. And what we've been doing is bringing on more and more home nurseries, more childminders over the last few years. We now have about 300. And we're looking to scale. We've been mostly in London. We've just opened in Manchester and Birmingham. Next month, we're looking to grow basically almost everywhere in England currently. The next few years are about scaling, and we want to get to tens of thousands of childminders and then, see how this could work in other countries, just like Teach First did.
Aside from Teach First and Tiney, just to go backwards then, I wanted to talk about the work that you do for the National Citizen Service Trust. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little bit about that organisation and your role there?
Yeah, sure. So for the last 4 years, I've been a non-executive chair of the National Citizen Service Trust. So I spend about a half a day a week to maybe a day a week chairing the board and doing the non-exec part of the work. So that's a world charter body. It's a government-supported organization. So most of our funding comes from government. Unlike Teachers, we got some government money, but Tiney, we don't get any government money. And the whole idea is to help young people at the cusp of adulthood. So working mostly with 16-year-olds. And the idea is to help them around social action and to really work with young people different from themselves and really build a knowledge of modern Britain. So what got me first excited about NCS was the idea that most young people in this country, I've been everywhere basically in England in almost every town. And so many in the schools I visit don't know young people different from themselves.
Yeah.
And that's not just ethnic differences and other differences like that. It's also geographic differences. I think kids in London are very different from kids in, Hull or Grimsby. The more they have an opportunity, this is really the biggest opportunity for kids, young people, 16-year-olds, to come together and work with teenagers different from themselves, basically, and see their commonality. And that to me is the most exciting part of NCS and how they could start working together.
That sounds fantastic. Okay, brilliant. It seems to me that the labour market is accelerating and the education system is not really moving as quickly as we need it to. How do we bridge that gap, Brett? And how do we start training our young people up for the world of work in the new digital economy?
What that means changes every few years, right? So where I think I've gotten to is, look, the education system has to give the base. Like, I think there has to be some knowledge. There's always a massive debate among educationalists that I always struggle to take a side on between sort of people who are very knowledge rich, who believe, you should know your multiplication times tables by heart, you should know some poems, you should know facts, things like that, versus, much more progressive educators who have I kind of come down in the middle. Maybe I'm a bit of a squishy guy, but I think you do need a lot of knowledge and you do need to know how to learn. It's very difficult, I think, for a national school system, to get people ready for certain jobs.
Sure.
Especially when those jobs are changing every few years. And the national school system has to educate everyone, basically, right? So the national school system has to educate plumbers, storekeepers, lawyers, tech entrepreneurs, everyone, basically. So I think the one thing is, I'm not sure employers should be looking for the education system to get young people ready for a specific job, because I don't think that's the education system's job. I think that might be employers' job, or maybe that's that's more that can be done through apprenticeships or in different ways. And I think anyway, whatever skills you need for a specific job will change every few years, right? So even if you train people perfectly for the jobs of a real shortage of engineers today, not sure if those skills are the right skills in 5 years' time. But what the education system should do is ensure that kids leave with the right knowledge and the right ability to learn, so that they can continue to grow and scale their knowledge, and scaffold their knowledge as they get older. I think that's what a good education system can do. And then as they get older, maybe when they're 16 or 18, funnel them off to different apprenticeships or to different, further education learnings, where they can then really deepen their knowledge in something that maybe is much more career-based, depending on, what skills you need for that career at that particular moment in time.
What do you think the UK can learn from North America, the US, Canada? What are they doing right over there? Because they seem to be churning people out a little bit better than we are in Western Europe. I don't know what your stance is on that.
I would say England has a better system than the US, personally. And the reason I'd say that, first of all, is it's a much fairer system. There's less failures in the UK than the US. I think there's a lot of really awful schools in the US, first of all, which would be shut down by Ofsted. There's no national inspector in the US. So people can hate Ofsted all they want. But I think what Ofsted does well is it prevents really awful schools from existing in England, which do exist in the US. And there's definitely a lot of schools in the US, and I visited a few, that would not be allowed to open here. So that's the first thing I'd say. When you're looking at an education system, you have to look at the whole thing. And the worst schools in America are among the worst schools in any industrialized country in the world, right? You just don't want those schools to exist, I think. What the US does do better, and this is, I was saying before, is I think that liberal arts education, which I do think maybe there's some huge advantages to. I think in the UK, we have to our young people specialize too young, at 16, which is a really young age to have to specialize in a few things. And, at universities in America, you go to university and you're still, even if you specialize at university, you maybe only do a quarter or a third of your classes in that topic. When I was in education, I took art. I studied economics, but I took stuff in art history. I took, tons of different subjects. And I think, that gives you a more flexible education, because I think what you realize is the skills you need for any sort of job changes over time. So I do think maybe the British system is a bit too rigid and people specialize too early. But I'm not convinced the American system is better than the British system. I think there's too much failure in the US system. And I think the one thing the UK system has improved a lot is it's increased the floor of what schools do. I think you have less failure here than you used to.
That's interesting. I wanted to ask you about inequality, and what you do is sort of trying to bring quality education to low income families and the stuff you did at Teach First, for sure. So I wanted to ask you about your outlook on that, and whether you think that the effect of inequality is basically making the education system in the UK worse, or are we seeing improvements in the way children from low-income backgrounds are achieving Oxbridge or Russell Group universities and stuff like that? Is that getting better or worse? What are you seeing, Brett, at the moment?
Yeah, it is getting better. I mean, statistically, it's getting better, which I think is great. And I think rightly, Oxbridge and the Russell Group universities are rightly, I think, taking in more kids from comprehensive schools and from different income levels. And then I know it was even something in the newspaper a week or two ago in the Times around, other private school pushing back and complaining about that. But in my mind, 9% of kids go to private schools. I don't see why more than 9% of Oxford or Cambridge should come from private schools, because I guarantee there's just as many smart kids in every school in the country, and I've seen them, as there are in any private school. That's definitely an improvement when you start seeing more and more kids from comprehensive getting into top universities. I'm definitely a glass half full person. The trend has improved. I think there's structural issues that are now causing problems. I think COVID has caused problems where it's hit kids from lower incomes much more than higher incomes. I think cost of living crisis that we're all living through. I mean, there's a lot of young people and children out there who are hungry, who are going to bed hungry. And, this was true even a few years ago. I visited schools where I talked to teachers who were buying sneakers or, trainers for the kids in their classes, or, extra food or things. And I remember talking to one 16-year-old who was just telling me about how he was studying with GCSEs and how difficult it was because he shared a bed, not a bedroom, but a bed with his brother. And he didn't have any place to study, basically. So I think these structural problems, that's not something education can necessarily overcome.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I completely agree. Tell us a little bit about Brett outside of work.
Sure. So I'm married. I have 3 kids, and I spend a lot of time with my children. I like to swim a lot I sometimes like to swim in the ponds in Hampstead Heath, which is fun. I mean, that's basically me spending a lot of time with my family.
So you jump into freezing cold water. Is it the cold water therapy, or is it the actual swimming?
I do. I like swimming overall, but the freezing cold water has become one of my fun things to do.
My wife does sea swimming like at dawn, like 3 days a week. It's crazy. I don't understand it, but she swears by this Wim Hof, cold water therapy stuff. It seems to be getting really popular, doesn't it?
I know. It's fun. Yeah. I wish I lived near the sea. I miss that. I grew up near the beach, and I grew up as a lifeguard and surfing and everything. And I definitely miss living near the beach. That's something I truly miss.
Absolutely. Okay. What career advice would you give to your 21-year-old self then, Brett?
Yeah, I think take advantage of opportunities. I think it's hard to. I think people often want a really clear path, and I think maybe it's good to have a general idea of where you want to go. But opportunities pop up, and I think I certainly was lucky. I had a few times in my life where something popped up, and I just jumped at it and took advantage of it at that moment. I think the other advice I give is to have great mentors and coaches and ask advice. I've always had almost I'd say a team of mentors. I always have I'd say 6 or 7 people who, at various points, I'm asking for different types of advice. And yeah, I think that's probably been one of my most powerful accelerators of either my career or my knowledge or my ability is just, having lots of people who I can ask for advice and help for at different points.
What person, book, or piece of content have you been inspired by recently?
My daughter and I have, who's now 16, we've had a book club where we read a book a month together. We've been doing it since she was about 4 years old,
Oh, wow.
and we've kept it going. She's a really big reader. We recently read *Sapiens*, which was a
Oh,
Yuval
yeah.
Harari book,
Yuval
which
Harari, yeah.
blew me away. It's probably definitely my favorite book of the last year, I'd say.
Yeah, it's a classic, isn't it?
Where it was one of these books that just changed my perception of just life, basically, in a way that very few books had. And last year, the other book, Thinking Fast and Slow, was another one.
Oh, Daniel Kahneman, yeah.
Yeah, Hahnemann, which I studied economics, and that also changed my view of economics in a deep way.
Sure.
Around behavioral economics, where you just realize how we make decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know you've done some work with Jamie Oliver to develop Bite Back 2030, a national alliance to halve youth obesity by 2030. Can you tell us a little bit about that, how that's going, and yeah, where people can find out about that?
Yeah. So in some ways it's going great, but in some ways it's not. I'd say so. Are we going to have childhood obesity by 2030? It's. I would say we're not on track right now. We were just chatting about it. I'm on the board of that. When I left Teach First, I spent a few months working with Jamie Oliver on getting it started, and it's something he's very passionate about. And now I'm a non-exec on the board. And unfortunately, things aren't going in the right direction. It is something that I'm really passionate about because again, I think we're talking about civil rights issues here.
Yeah,
I think when you get down to it, there's a lot of young people out there whose diet is just really killing them, basically.
yeah,
And I think it's one of these things where in the future we're going to look back and think, how could we have fed our children in that way? And it's just something that I think in the future we'll think people were insane in 2022 to allow so many young people and children to eat the way they're eating. And I think what we see is it's almost like maybe cigarettes in the 1950s, like it's the societal pressure on the kids, what to eat.
sure.
We have these amazing youth boards. So it's been a very youth-led charity where as much as possible, and Jamie was very much into this, like it's not fronted by Jamie, or it's fronted by the young people. And what the young people say is, and you can go on our website and see some videos we made of it. Follow a person through their life, and they're bombarded with images from junk food producers. They go to the corner shop. 90% of the choices available to them are awful, almost like
Yeah,
poisons for them. They go to school. What's available for them? Much more candy bars and crap than anything healthy that they should be eating. It's not like this is a choice thing. I mean, this is what young people on the bus stop. The chances of having an advertisement there for something that is really quick, cheap, easy, but totally bad for them is very likely. Going to be the ad on the bus stop. So our whole society is set up in a way. And I think, again, there's so much evidence now that eating habits that we are ingraining in teenagers and almost forcing teenagers down into, for the most part, has massive effects on their physicality and on their mental state and
yeah.
stays with them through life. So this is I think one of those issues. I do think in the future people are going to think we were crazy in 2022 to allow our society to go this way. And I think we're beginning to get that. I think I've
Yeah.
even seen the last 4 or 5 years as I've gotten involved in this, I think people are getting to understand this more and more. That's not just like a choice thing. It's not lack of exercise. It's not, having a second piece of cake or something like that. Jamie Oliver would say, one of his lines is, a cake never lies. You could have a piece of cake, like it's fine. You know what a cake is. It's a nice treat. But what you don't realize is all this other stuff that people are almost being fed at school, at,
Yeah.
corner shops everywhere. That's the problem.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think that's a bigger problem than people realize. But Brett, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a privilege. I've loved getting your perspective on a few things. Where can people find you? Where can people reach out to you?
Sure. I mean, well, I'm on Twitter at Wigdortz is just my Twitter handle, Wigdortz, Wigdortz. The website's Tiney, Tiney.co. So hopefully we have people out there who might want to open a nursery in their home, or if you're looking for a place for your kids, come on our website.
Absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much. Thanks for coming on, Brett.
Thanks, Gareth.
As you quite possibly have heard me mentioning in the past, we record the mass majority of our episodes at an amazing studio facility here in Cardiff at Tramshed Tech. Tramshed Tech is a collaborative community of entrepreneurs and scaling businesses geared towards supporting growth in tech, digital and creative industries across an ever-increasing collection of locations and partner locations, UK-wide and internationally. It really is the perfect place for your business to start up, scale up, accelerate or innovate. Head over to tramshedtech.co.uk or just search Tramshed Tech on your favourite social media platform.